Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today to talk about algorithms of war, the use of artificial intelligence in armed conflict. My name is Janina Dill. I am a professor of global security here at the Blavatnik School and the co-director of ELAC, the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. The Machine Did It Coldly is the title of a Guardian article which 5 days ago introduced readers here in the United Kingdom to Lavender, a powerful AI system used to generate over 37,000 targets in Gaza. The article paints a dystopian picture of AI identifying individuals as legitimate targets of attack based on tenuous connections with Hamas, tracing their every movement and alerting officers to when they were in targetable locations, most often in their homes surrounded by family. The tale is one of AI replicating and amplifying human biases and human beings being reduced to rubber stamping the machine's choices about who to kill, when, and where. A headline in CIPA on the use of artificial intelligence by Ukraine, meanwhile, called it a secret weapon. I quote, "Outmanned and out-resourced by Russia, Ukraine's smart use of artificial intelligence will turn the tide in the war," end quote. Ukraine uses artificial intelligence for reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, for identification of the war dead, but also for attacks and sabotage inside Russian territory. So is IA the harbinger of immoral, lawless killing sprees, or a smart way to circumvent well-armed imperialist bullies? Does whether it is one or the other depend on how AI is used for what combat functions, or who uses it and to what end? Have we seen yet in Ukraine and Gaza the range of ways in which AI can be used in war, in targeting, but also related combat tasks? And what are the prospects for drawing on ethics and law to channel the power of AI so it may be used to protect human beings rather than dehumanize war entirely? To answer some of these questions, we are joined tonight by 4 eminent experts. We are particularly honored to have as guest Joel Rosenthal, the president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Welcome to Oxford.
Thank you.
He is also a distinguished scholar on ethics in public life, including US foreign policy, war, peace, and human rights. He is joined by 3 members of the BSG faculty, so our own, so to speak. Kieran Martin, to my left, is a professor of practice in the management of public organization. He joined the Blavatnik School after 20 years in the UK civil service, where he held, among others, the role of chief executive of the National Cybersecurity Center at GCHQ. Brianna Rosen is a senior strategy and policy fellow here at the school who works on ethics of artificial intelligence. She's also a senior fellow of Just Security and has over 10 years of experience in US government working on national security. And to my left is Tom Simpson, associate professor of philosophy and public policy, bringing some much needed interdisciplinarity to the team. He directs the military leadership and judgment program, and his research focuses on, among other issues, ethics of autonomous weapons and cyber attacks. All panelists speak in their personal capacity only. I will engage them in about 40 minutes of conversation, and I hope to have thereafter some time for questions from the audience, about 15 minutes or so. So if we could start, I'd like to talk to Brianna first, if that's possible. You have written very recently extensively on the role of AI in contemporary conflicts. Could you briefly describe what the major trends are in how combat operations unfold that are particularly linked to the expanding role of artificial intelligence in war?
Thank you, Janina, and thank you everyone for being here today. I want to frame this discussion with 2 overarching points. First, AI is already at war. This isn't some future threat, but one that is already here. Second, regulation has not caught up. The debate on military AI has been for far too long focused on the wrong question, the issue of banning lethal autonomous weapon systems, rather than the integration of AI into military operations more broadly. From Gaza to Ukraine, AI is being used in multifaceted ways in war to assist military decision-making processes and target identification, to support accountability mechanisms, to wage and counter cyber and information operations, and in weapon systems that are becoming increasingly autonomous. But what we are witnessing in these conflicts is that the most immediate threat is not the AI apocalypse where machines take over the world, but rather humans leveraging AI to establish new patterns of violence and domination over each other.
So these are the three trends. Could you give us an example, maybe focusing particularly on Gaza, since on everybody's mind, for each of these trends?
Right. So what's happening in Gaza is this. AI is increasing the pace and scale of war, compounding risks to civilians in a way that is secret with little transparency or regulation. Think about the drone program on steroids, but at a much larger scale. Now, one of the biggest applications of AI right now is in intelligence analysis, where AI is being used to analyze vast amounts of data and inform decision-making concerning the use of force. And Gaza is a particularly salient example of this. So in the past, Israel would run out of targets, that is, known combatants or military objectives. Today, that's not a barrier to killing anymore. Israel is using AI as a force multiplier, in the IDF's own words, by removing resource constraints and allowing it to identify more targets more quickly at lower levels than in the past. And this isn't merely speculation. I really want to stress that. The IDF itself has acknowledged that it's using AI tools to accelerate targeting. Now, as war speeds up, risks to civilians increase. Target verification and other precautionary obligations required under international law become much harder to fulfill, implying more civilians will be misidentified and killed, even with humans fully in the loop. And keeping a human in the loop, by the way, is not the same as meaningful human control. Things like automation and action biases mean that there's a high risk that human review becomes essentially perfunctory, that humans are rubber stamping machine decisions. And this leads to a removal of direct moral responsibility for killing and the desensitization of violence overall. Now, the risks to civilians are exponentially higher when states adopt permissive targeting criteria and when the machine gets it wrong. If recent reports are correct, Israel's AI systems are accurate only 90% of the time, meaning that for every 10 militants that Israel kills, one is a civilian. And that error rate may in fact be much higher, particularly since all the well-documented problems with AI in the domestic context, from discriminatory algorithms to automation bias and hallucination, are amplified in the fog of war. Ultimately, I see the military AI debates as following the same flawed logic of the drone debates. Just because the technology is theoretically more accurate or precise doesn't mean we will see less wrongful killing. Now, that's just what we know. There is much we don't know due to a complete lack of transparency about how these states are developing and using these classified systems. In December, I published a list of questions in just security that policymakers and the public should be asking right now about Israel's use of AI in Gaza. Important questions such as, what does the human target verification process look like? Does Israel have learning and accountability mechanisms in place for when mistakes are inevitably made? Is it relying on allied-provided intelligence, including US and UK intelligence, for producing AI-generated targets? To my knowledge, none of these questions have been answered or even asked. And so we urgently need to have more robust public debate in forums such as these, because AI is already at war and regulation is simply not keeping up.
Thank you. Brianna mentioned the drone debate already, right. Joel, if I can come to you now. This isn't the first time we have technological innovation in war. Is there anything we can learn from previous kind of step changes in technologies or tools of warfare, and how we should think conceptually about innovation and what it means, how it puts pressure on our rules and how wars unfold?
Thank you, Janina. I just wanted to start by thanking you for organizing this panel.
The credit goes to Brianna.
Thank you to Brianna. And thank you for ELAC in what you do and what you do here in this school. And I think given the news, recent events, just underlines the importance of the role of ethics as it relates to the formation of public policy. And also the notion of thinking about our common humanity, under duress in real time. And also highlighting the sort of ancient principle of mitigating civilian harm as the premise for the work that you do. And again, just beginning with the idea, Brianna, you've spoken very eloquently about this, that we sort of know the norms. They're been debated for some time, and yet we see the implementation challenges, the reality on the ground. and this being a place to reckon with that. So thank you for organizing the panel, and thank you for doing it in person, by the way. So many of these things are done online these days. So the way I'm thinking about the historical context, Brianna mentioned it briefly, is if we scroll back and think about the revolution in military affairs, really about almost 30 years old now, with the beginning of precision-guided weapons and all of the different ethical questions that were raised around weaponizing drones and so on. So I see where we are right now as being very much in line with the moral questions that came up then. The question of speed is making it even more challenging. But I do think it's helpful to think about the situation in relation to the revolution in military affairs, and in some sense, we're writing the next chapter with AI. So let me just suggest what's different, perhaps different about this moment. And I'm going to suggest really briefly, maybe we can come to it in conversation, 3 shifts that are going on. One is a shift from military hardware to private sector software. Right? So we see the use of, whether it's Gospel or Lavender, you can tell us more about those software systems. But they're being used now, and they're being used, as we know, also in gathering of intelligence, and also in the selection of targets, and also in the actual execution of the military operation. And so right now, when you have a military operation, you've got people in the Pentagon having to talk to Elon Musk about his Starlink system in Ukraine, and you can imagine, conversations with people like Andrew Karp and other people working in Palantir and so on. So it seems to me something different is happening there. The second shift is something Brianna already mentioned, but I think needs to be underlined, which is the shift from traditional military command to a machine, right? The sort of outsourcing of moral authority to the machine. And the shorthand version I have of thinking about this is, Henry Kissinger writes an article about his first article on artificial intelligence in 2018 in the Atlantic magazine. Why is Henry Kissinger talking about artificial intelligence? Well, maybe he could see where we were going, but if you remember, the title of the article was something like, How the Enlightenment Ends. How does the Enlightenment end? The Enlightenment ends when we take moral accountability from the human being and from human reason and export it to the machine, which the quote you mentioned was perfect, which is, it did it coldly. Well, what did it do? It took a life, or took many lives, right? So exporting the moral accountability is the second shift. And then the third, and this came up in the recent articles about the uses in the Middle East, which is this notion of moving from accountability to some kind of efficiency. And I'd love to know what the philosophers are thinking about this, that there's somehow, we can somehow come up with metrics and formulas that, again, the machine can calculate, and that's somehow a better sense, some utilitarian sense of accountability, and sort of relying on the algorithm and the AI to do that. So that's kind of how I see where we are right now.
One remarkable thing is when talking to military professionals, they often stress that proportionality, the weighing of military advantage and civilian harm, isn't a scientific judgment, that it requires expertise and reflection. And yet we are also drawn to the notion that the more information, the more efficiently processed, the better the judgment will be, which in some sense runs counter to the idea that it requires deep thinking and expertise and an actual human judgment.
Right.
Maybe we can bring in the moral philosopher here. So if we have a technology that has in principle the ability not just to reshape how we think about decision-making in war, but also actually redistribute harms in war, just and unjust harms, redistribute violence. How should we think about existing legal and ethical rules that have evolved in the way they apply? And do we actually need to push for new rules to think about war?
Okay. Thanks, Janina. And just to say, I've got many hats, but 2 of the hats that are relevant here are, one is as a philosopher in disciplinary terms, but I'm also a former military professional myself, practicing. And so I think, can I just inject some of that into here? Because I think it's important to recognize the pressures, the operational pressures that have led to the adoption of AI in the ways that have been described. So roboticists sometimes talk about the 3Ds which robots are able to do, jobs which are dirty, dull, or dangerous. And a great proportion of soldiering actually falls into those buckets, sometimes one at a time, sometimes all three at the same time. And so just at a minimal level, what autonomy offers is the chance for taking your own people out of danger, reducing the danger that they're exposed to maximize the lethality that the enemy is exposed to. And that ultimately is the job of the soldier. The job of the soldier is to impose political will on the enemy, and that's achieved at the end of the day by killing a sufficient number of the enemy or rendering them combat inoperable to achieve that political victory. So we need to be very clear-sighted about that. And I completely echo the point that's been made here as well, which is that the debate for many years has fixated on what's often used in the lingo as killer robots. So, you know, a drone flying around with image recognition algorithms able to target someone and kill someone lethally. And that is obviously a technological possibility at some point in the future, maybe closer than we think, but it's clearly not the only use case, and it may not be the most important use case. And what we've seen highlighted here is other uses of AI in terms of generating an intelligence picture of the battlefield and recommending targets to commanders. Now, the reason the military have gone into that is it's very, one of the ways of conceptualizing conflict that military officers will talk about is that victory happens when you, the phrase is when you get inside the enemy's OODA loop, okay? So the OODA loop stands for observe, orient, decide, act. And it was coined for fighter pilots. So if you could observe what the enemy fighter plane was doing first, orient yourself to it, act, decide what to do, and then act. If you can do that quicker than your opposing adversary, the cumulative effect of being faster in the OODA loop is tactical victory and ultimately strategic victory. And so, so that conceptualization has been applied to the counterterrorism campaigns of the last 20 years, where the goal has been to get inside terrorist organizations' OODA loop, to disable them so they're unable to achieve the effect that they want to achieve. And that's the conceptualization that's exactly at work with the IDF right now. And so I would have a slightly different categorization of saying that this is the human commander being taken out of the fight. I think my own view is that the human command decision is to engage in this form of operation. And then once you engage in that operation, there's a systemic logic that then takes place at that point. So the crucial question is, which we must absolutely focus on, which is what are the morally relevant factors that ought to be taken account of when you put in place a system that's going to operate like this? And so I think, just to really drill down, and I'll close there, is I think Brianna's comments right at the start highlighted very powerfully. So for those who are not aware, these allegations have arisen around the use of the lavender system by the IDF in the Gaza conflict. And I think there remains to be a full response from the IDF. I think this will work itself out in public conversation. But the report currently is that the lavender system identifies low-level Hamas members as targets, and it will accept an error rate of 10%. And then included in the article was the claim that collateral damage would be allowed at a 1 to 15 or even 1 to 20 rate. So for each one Hamas member targeted, up to 15 or 20 civilians were accepted as collateral damage. Now, clearly that's a dramatically excessive ratio, which I think would never be accepted in other cases. So we await to see what the IDF's response to that will be. But I think these two ratios are really key because they highlight moral attention on what is an acceptable error rate and then what is the acceptable proportionality judgment on collateral damage. I actually think we've got no alternative to trying to make those judgments and adjudications.
Do we think that this acceptable ratio that we think is unacceptable, but the fact that it became policy is in some sense due to the operational context that the IDF is operating in, or do we think it is actually causally tied to the use of artificial intelligence?
Okay, yeah, great. So I've got no more information on that question than I think anyone else here. I think all of us have got to take into account the psychological stresses and sort of psychological, social, political stresses that were the nation of Israel and policymakers were under at the time where the conflict started. But that's a psychological explanation. The sort of deeper question is, does the technology itself push towards that? And I think that's the point where you have to have people in command, both military people and then political oversight of the military, which says, with clarity and with, if you like, degree of emotional distance, this is actually what the acceptable rate is. So Obama famously said, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was no civilian casualties was the requirement at some point through the drone campaign. Now, whether it was lived up to or not was a different matter, but that was the objective, the political objective.
And if I can ask one more follow-up, and then I promise I'll leave you alone. So law demands that the attacker does everything feasible to verify that a particular target that's been selected is in fact a military objective. If you look at the process as it has unfolded, that the system generates targets and there's a general high confidence in it processing much more information than a human being could. Is it actually enough to, is the law fit for purpose here to say that is the standard? Everything feasible means a human looks at that output of the machine and then makes a decision based on that? Or do we need a law? Do we need a discourse about concretizing what that actually means when a human operator works with artificial intelligence?
So I, as a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say how law is implemented on the feasibility. And actually, Janina, you may want to weigh in on that. But what I do think is that clearly the context in which an operation takes place is going to have a very shaping impact on how, quote, feasibility is interpreted. So if you were in Kiev in February the 24th, 2022, when armored columns are rolling across the border, and you had autonomous weapons available to you then to contest the Russian invasion, your conception of feasibility is going to be much more permissive than at the other end of things, something like a Northern Ireland style counterinsurgency campaign, which has been going on for 20 or 30 years, where you've got a lot of time and energy. And then the pertinent question is, where does the Gaza campaign sit in relation to that?
I mean, it does seem to me that the pace and scale that Brianna emphasized, the desensitization and the overconfidence together, if they are taken without further reflection on what they mean, they are quite prone to evacuating precautionary principle of their meaning. But if I could move on to Kieran. Kieran, AI obviously has uses and poses challenges outside of war, and societies have been grappling with how to make sense of that. Is there any lessons learned for kind of rapid technological change that in some sense challenges most normal people's understanding of technology, and how we can form a public discourse and articulate policy answers to the challenges that poses? Is there any lessons learned from outside war for how this shapes armed conflict?
Well, thanks for having me, I think, because it's very hard to follow those contributions, particularly as somebody who wouldn't describe themselves as either a military or an AI expert. But I hope that cybersecurity and cyber warfare, as some call it, offers some clue. Very interested in this context in what Tom has just said, for example, about the allegations around the Lavender system, because the moral judgment implied there is something that has been familiar to military leaders and political leaders for generations. And even recently, if you think back to the ISIL campaign and the drone campaign, it was common practice for people who knew themselves to be targets to have children accompany them. So in some respects, I think, and this is a lesson from wider uses of rapidly advancing technologies, don't always kid yourselves that these problems are new, just because they involve very sophisticated technology. Furthermore, we did ask at the start, is AI use moral, or words to that effect? AI is computer code, maths, and engineering. It has no morals, it has no ethics. And I think the lessons both from military campaigns, but also from other uses, is that this is all about being use case specific. And I know that sounds very practical and very technocratic, but it matters. In the course of this conversation so far, we've talked about, not deliberately, just inter alia, we've talked about the use of AI for intelligence gathering, for targeting, for protective security of one's own equities and troops. We could talk about things like stockpile inventories. We could talk about Tom implied about bomb disposal capabilities, protecting humans. These are all different. And I think if you look at the approach to AI adaptation in wider society, being use case specific isn't a clever way out of moral arguments, but it's a way out of it's a way towards getting things right. I don't normally recommend that people read government papers because people have better things to do, but Actually, for a general overview of AI risk in advanced digital economies, I think the British government's October 2023 paper on AI risk, this is civilian AI risk, is pretty good because it says, look, there are the here and now problems of disinformation, huge scale labor market disruption. There's the potentially existential risk of, as Tom and I colloquially call it, the killer robot. And in the middle, there's things around chemical and cyber weapons, and they're all different, and you handle them very differently. And just to give you an example of that, and again, this is practical, let's take that mid-tier, very serious risk for civilian casualties of or civilian disruption of biochemical weapons powered by AI or cyber weapons powered by AI, because how you deal with them is completely different. And it's really simple to understand. If you want to get pharma GPT to make you a lethal virus worse than anything we've had before, it's quite possible that advanced AI in the not too distant future could design something. The problem for the attacker is how do you translate that from code into a real airborne virus that will infect all of us? So that's the limitation.
Specific in your
I won't be too specific.
advice.
The problem for us as defenders is if they make that leap, then all you've got to defend is the human body and a race for a vaccine. So you've got a big problem for the attacker and a big problem for the defender. Let's use the same analysis for cyber. In cyber, you have something that's much easier for the attacker. You can just do worm GPT to write you some really advanced computer code. And you don't have to worry about how to get it into the physical world because that's not what you're trying to do. The problem for the attacker then is that you can do the equal and opposite defensive computation to just block it in a way that the human body can't block a biochemical weapon. So ethics and morality aside, and I'm not obviously demeaning, that's why we're here, it's really important. The practical strategies towards countering biochemical threats using AI and cyber threats using AI are fundamentally and completely different. So I'm sorry to use the age-old tactic, maybe I'm getting more academic as every passing year at the university of, just taking issue with the question. AI in war, there are so many different ways of splicing the question that I think we really have to focus on the applied uses.
If I can follow up then, if one of the uses that is agitating us at the moment is in target identification, right? And there are an existing set of rules, internationally recognized rules, but they are in some sense already formulated in fairly vague standard setting terms, like, distinction between civilians and combatants, minimize civilian casualties as much as possible, and then proportionality, right? These are already relatively vague rules, but they are widely accepted. Now, if the specific, and I understand, your main message to us is be specific in identifying the problem. If the problem now is that the scale and the pace of target identification has increased by an order of magnitude through artificial intelligence, and the role of the human is reduced to the very end point of the identification or the generation of the target, right? To the point where the human only gets an information that they are supposed to have confidence in and then either says yes or no. Right? If that is the problem, what would you say is the political context or the policy response that could in principle be successful here?
Well, others may have a better answer than me. I would start from saying someone is responsible for the outcomes that generates, and that's where you work back from.
Yeah.
And again, whilst some of the potential on the ground consequences of the sort of thing that you've just outlined, Janina, are horrific, I'm not sure there's anything wildly complicated in what you've just described in public policy terms. There's a deliberate decision to make all of that happen. We are not yet at the stage, in my view, of any state or non-state actor with these powers designing something that's going to do that for themselves in a way that cannot be stopped. So what you're talking about, and this is a very common thing in this debate, is political and social and moral choices being masked by the technology. Everything you've talked about is a political moral. Yes, it relates to how you do the technology, but there's nothing there that could not have been changed by an instruction to the coders.
Right. So we have law, right? And we have had some efforts to apply or reform this law with a view to technological changes. When it comes to artificial intelligence, these efforts haven't led very far so far. So I'd like to come back to Brianna and ask you if the existing rules is all we have, and AI is what is happening, what would be policy recommendations for an actor that in good faith wishes to concretize legal rules to the evolving AI context?
So given the prospects for legal regulation at the international level, particularly for AI technologies beyond lethal autonomous weapon system, like the target identification issue that we've been talking about, because the prospects for that are so incredibly slim, and because it might actually be counterproductive in some cases to legally regulate that type of activity, I really see the solution as lying more at the policy level. And as with the drone program, it's important to keep in mind that these policies should both be informed by and adhere to existing laws, including both IHL and IHRL. So I think, for example, of the guidance, the policy guidance on direct action that we enacted during the Obama administration, which in part gave policy guidance for drone strikes, the PPG. That's, I think, kind of a potential model of something that could be done for various applications of military AI. And I agree with Kieran that we have to be very specific about what those applications are. And I think that we have to not only be very specific about the use cases, but we have to define, operationalize, and institutionalize what meaningful human control is in these types of processes, because we don't even have a generally agreed upon definition, nor have we operationalized what that means in practice, and nor have we instituted, as far as we know, in the public sphere, institutional processes to ensure that happens. But these technologies are all dual use, and it's important to underscore, and Kieran raised this point as well, that they can be used as equally for war as for peace. They can be used to reduce civilian harm in war, or they can be used to accelerate civilian harm, which is what I think we're seeing here. And ways in which we could use this technology to reduce civilian harm, it's really a political choice, which is what we've been talking about. Policymakers can, in fact, leverage the speed at which AI systems operate to do things like introduce tactical pauses, more carefully review targets, ensure that the precautionary measures that we've been talking about are prioritized, improve humanitarian assistance flows, and consider alternative options to the use of force. So there are all of these things that policymakers can do with AI that can benefit civilians, but we don't see that necessarily happening in practice. That's in theory. And a legal ban, for the reasons that I've outlined, and because powerful states like the US, like Russia, have said that we don't need a new legal treaty on AI. Lethal autonomous weapon systems are already regulated under international law. Because of that, it seems that a legal ban is not only impractical, but may be counterproductive because of the potential benefits of using AI if policymakers choose to use it wisely. But I would highlight three things that policymakers must do as a matter of urgency. The first is to press Israel to adopt the principles in the US-led political declaration on the responsible use of military AI. So Israel hasn't signed this declaration, neither has China. Ukraine, by the way, has signed it. And this declaration is not legally binding, nor is it sufficient to really address all of the challenges that we've briefly touched on today, but it is a start towards building norms surrounding AI development and use. And the second thing that we have to urgently do is operationalize these broad principles that have been articulated for responsible military AI use and demonstrate how they can be implemented in specific scenarios. And this needs to be done before and after things like the upcoming international summits in Helsinki and Seoul. And finally, we need to find ways to introduce friction into the decision-making process to prevent issues like automation bias and ensure that human verification is in fact meaningful. These are 3 steps toward reform that can be taken immediately today if the political will exists to do so.
That's fascinating, particularly the idea of introducing friction into the decision-making process, right? So the idea that human control must be meaningful. Can I maybe ask both you and Joel about this notion? You mentioned IHL, which is international humanitarian law, and IHRL, which is international human rights law. And we've talked a lot about IHL, which is just distinction, precautions, and proportionality. But under human rights law, there has been a discourse around the notion that we should have a right to a human decision, right? Can I maybe ask both of you to reflect on whether you think that goes in the right direction, or is it ultimately just an empty signifier? Because right now we do technically have a human decision in targeting, and yet we are seeing the challenges of IA playing out as they are. Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I can just jump in. I think it's building on what Brianna's already said, and comes back to my opening comments, which is, I think what we're seeing is a continuing distancing ourselves in a political sense, in a cultural sense, in a social sense, in the big picture from the appalling violence of war. I mean, this, again, it begins with the revolution, military affairs, this sort of this radical asymmetry, riskless war, virtual war, right? This was the language of virtually 30 years ago, right? So I think, again, there's some continuity there. And I think, again, just to be mindful of that might sound simple, but we get into these conversations very quickly, but that is the political and cultural context that we're operating in. And then the question still remains, it's a threshold question, the threshold to go to war. Right? There is a threshold, and the questions we've been asking ourselves over this 30-year period is, does this technology lower that threshold? It's just literally easier politically and also operationally to use these weapons. And then even to the extent where if you don't use them, you have to explain it to your constituents why you're not using it, right? Why aren't we using this? We have it. So I think, again, just being mindful of that. And then the last thing I would just say, I do think that there is a moment here, there is a historic moment here for some kind of intervention. When we've seen innovations in the use of force in the past, we've seen a reaction. That's what the Lieber codes were during the American Civil War. That's what the Geneva Conventions were, right? That's what, and so forth. After every sort of use of new technology to take life, there's been sort of this countervailing, answer to say, well, we need to limit this in some way. And I hope that we kind of see this as a moment to sort of intervene and to take that seriously. My concern is that we're drifting now into cyber, right? We're, sort of militarizing cyberspace, we're militarizing outer space. These treaties, to the extent that they exist, it seems to me like we're just sort of blowing past any kind of agreements. So I think step one is awareness, and also the opportunity to intervene in this moment.
Is it the right geopolitical moment, though? Because these kinds of intervention are often driven by scandalization, right? And we have a certain amount of scandalization around the war in Gaza. Yeah. But at the same time, we have that countervailing discourse around where AI is celebrated as Ukraine's means of resistance, right? Is that in some sense a kind of a pernicious configuration in which it's actually not that likely that we will get momentum behind an intervention, even if it is not a new law, for which the prospects are exceedingly slim?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think the answer is, right, technology is, you have to connect the means to the ends and to the consequences. So in that sense, that this is where the ethics they do come in precisely at that point, right? So the technology exists. I'm not suggesting that technology goes away, but as we think about uses, the decisions to use this technology, I hope we're mindful of that context.
Right.
Can I just jump in, Janina, as well? So I think the other key feature of the context is that the two paradigm conflicts that we have on the table right now, which we've been talking about, are obviously Israel-Gaza in relation to Hamas, and then Russia and Ukraine. But they're not the only scenarios that are exercising the minds of policymakers, clearly. And so there's a wider, now increasingly publicly talked about, question of a confrontation between NATO and Russia. Clearly it's not desired by anyone, certainly on the NATO side, but there's increasing awareness of the need to prepare for that. And then the stability of the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan Straits is clearly in the background elsewhere. And so I think I think it's inevitable that attempts to bring about some kind of treaty, quote, ban on autonomous weapons would fail, because the challenge with autonomous weapons, as contrasted with something like nuclear weapons, is that you've no means of verifying sufficiently reliably for yourself that your adversary has not developed those. So for a law-abiding country to make a treaty commitment not to develop these systems and to then comply with it may be to incur a colossal strategic vulnerability if these systems are as powerful as the technologists say that they might be. So I think there's been an inevitable failure, and not just inevitable failure, a sort of rightful failure of that process. Because if you think that the surest means of peace is actually robust deterrence, a robust military. You want a military that has the most powerful tools in its toolbox to defend you. But what it does push towards is this need for a kind of internally generated policy level process, which is owned by departments of defense, Ministry of Defense, working in conjunction with arms manufacturers and the new arms manufacturers who are also the software players, to inculcate and operationalize these principles that Brianna was talking about. So the five, I should know them off pat: explainable, trustworthy, responsible. Anyway, there's about five of them. Google will reveal them very quickly.
Yeah, do you want to come back in on this?
I agree with Tom that AI in war is here to stay. But I think there are a number of important steps that policymakers need to take that aren't being taken today. So you mentioned the right to a human decision. More work is needed to be done, and it's being done at Oxford, on how we instantiate that principle. But it's not just the decision point we need to focus on. There's a lot of focus on the decision point. We also need to look at the after action process, the processes for accountability. What accountability mechanisms are in place? What mechanisms are in place for reviewing potential mistakes and holding those accountable within the system for that? And I think the idea that I mentioned earlier of introducing friction into the decision-making process is a really fruitful area for future research, because it suggests that the machine can in some ways help humans make more ethical decisions if we're training it in the right way to do that. So if, for example, it's producing outputs and then it's prompting the human operators themselves to question the machine's output, like that's something that's really interesting. What are the ethical principles that need to be developed surrounding this issue? How do we implement them in policy to ensure that the machine itself is introducing those types of spaces for reflection and restraint that are not going to be organically in the process given the pace and scale of war? That's a deliberate policy choice that needs to be made.
I'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience. I would like you to please state your name and affiliation and keep any question very brief so that we can hear from a lot of people who would like to ask a question. Yeah, the gentleman here in the brown shirt.
Hey, thank you so much for this panel. I found it really interesting. I'm Jonathan. I'm a machine learning PhD student here at the university. And I was wondering, do we maybe have any cause for optimism about this technology, where if we take a very concrete case, if maybe in some cases it has a 10% error rate, well, I think the relevant question, like, what's the human error rate? If a human error rate is, let's say, 25%, well, at the end, obviously, there's lots of issues regarding interpretability and understanding how the decision comes about. But in practice, we are saving lives here, potentially.
Yeah, we have two questions online as well about asking us to identify areas of optimism and where potentially this technology can improve things. Who on the panel would like to take this up?
I don't mind having a quick go, and I would endorse the premise of the question. I think public confidence and informed public consent is key to this. So you asked me earlier, Janina, about examples from the civilian world, and plenty of AI experts will tell you that already autonomous vehicles, this is in civilian space, not the military space, autonomous vehicles are far safer than human-driven cars. But why are we still not using them in any mass market way? It's partly because we haven't perfected the regulatory model and the safety model, but that's a discussion for another day. It's also partly because as soon as an AI, as a driverless car hits and kills somebody, which sadly happens on the roads all the time, it's a different story, and people think, oh, these things cannot be trusted. So your point, it's a cautious point. In a rational world, if, let's say, you could prove beyond sufficient doubt that an error rate in the human sphere was 20% and the AI could reduce it to 10%, in a rational world, the obvious thing to do is to use AI. But already we're showing in the civilian world with autonomous vehicles that it's a bit more complicated than that. But I do think, and all I'm doing here is echoing Tom, those 3 Ds in general life of, dirty, dull, and dangerous, apply hugely in a conflict space. And I referenced bomb disposal work. I mean, clearly there are huge areas in which this type of activity could actually make things safer. But the point is, it will be a net benefit. To go back to Joel's point, there's nothing around, this sort of clean, casualty-free war. It's not a concept that's going to exist. We did delude ourselves a generation ago that this was possible. But again, repeating another point, this is not a moral or ethical question for the technology. It's how we use it.
I mean, and this is in some sense, and the idea of an error rate in targeting, first to establish it, like the fog of war and classification militate against that. But then you're assuming that's an epistemic problem. But what is an error in targeting? That might actually be the notion that there is no real metaphysically correct answer to what is and wasn't an error in targeting. So I don't think we live in a world where we can easily compare the error rate of Lavender to the error rate of the reasonable military commander. But Brianna, do you want to come in?
Sure, but there are simpler areas than just in targeting.
No, I understand that was where the example came from.
So what I'm optimistic about is this, that after more than 2 decades of drone use in the war on terror and beyond, we, civil society, academia, experts, we have the tools and the language to start to talk about these challenges, and we have a framework for beginning to address them. What I'm less optimistic about, or what I'm less sanguine about, is this idea that AI is going to save lives. Because as I said before, it's clear in theory that there are a number of applications where AI can save lives. And again, it depends on the specific use case that we're talking about. But if we're talking about target identification, my real concern is that we will have this illusion of precision because the machines are based on vast amounts of data. They're supposed to be so much smarter. But as we know, data is often incomplete, it's flawed, it's out of date. Data can be poisoned by adversaries, so it's the wrong kind of data. And all of this compounds in a really complex AI system where, incorrect, outdated, flawed data will lead to incorrect targeting results. But then because of the problem of automation bias that I mentioned, humans may have more confidence in those AI-generated results than they should. But, particularly in the context of Gaza, to say that AI has saved civilian lives here, I think it's impossible to say that when more than 33,000 civilians have been killed.
Tom?
So I agree with my premise to your question. Read my 2016 paper for a sort of full explanation. But in terms of reasons for optimism, so I think there is also reasons for optimism. So the deep paradox of nuclear weapons is that these systems have the capacity to destroy the world, and they've probably delivered 50 years of peace during the Cold War confrontation. I mean, it's not tidy, it's not comfortable. Might be true, and part of the reason for that is that no side had a guaranteed what the strategists call a first strike capability. So first strike capability is where your nuclear strike or even your conventional strike against an adversary's nuclear weapons capability would be guaranteed to wipe out that capability so you wouldn't face what they call a second strike. Now you don't actually, in order for you to deter an adversary, you don't need to have a demonstrated second strike capability. It just needs to be uncertain that the first strike will be successful. And if they don't have that kind of certainty, that's the destructiveness of these systems is such that it becomes irrational to use them. So I think AI may display something like that trajectory. So you think about the great power use of AI-enabled weapon systems against other great powers. The deep uncertainty will be how, is our AI better than their AI? That seems to me like a coin toss. I think a coin toss is not really enough for a rational decision maker to go to war on the basis of. So I think we may see a similar deterrent dynamic.
Any other questions? Dr. Richmond Barak.
Thank you so much. Daphne Richmond Barak. I'm an academic visitor here at Blavatnik. Thank you. This was a fascinating panel. And there are too few of these panels. I want to just put it out there that really there are not very many. There are many conferences and panels about AI in general, but the intersection of AI and armed conflict, AI and war is very rare, actually, this discussion. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to piggyback a little bit on the idea that we need to be more specific about what it is that we're talking about. And I wanted to suggest here perhaps something. It seems that we need to actually differentiate between different contexts, different decisions that are being made in armed conflict. something that seems to be problematic here and bothersome to most of us is this idea that in targeting, AI is being used, but there are a lot of other decisions that are being made in war that are, very, different from targeting. And so in targeting, it bothers us, but what at the ethical, moral, perhaps legal level, but what about other decisions, maybe decisions that are more strategic, decisions to go to war, decisions to enter war, what kind of operation, ground operation, aerial operation. So there are a lot of other aspects and where AI can actually build on kind of past experiences, past incidents, and kind of gather this data and tell you, okay, no, if you do a ground invasion here, it's not going to work out for this and this reason. So I think there's a lot more, and I actually really do agree that we need to be very more granulated, I guess, in a way. So when we use AI, for example, to enhance force protection, is that always a good thing, or is that sometimes not a good thing? When we use AI to do a better triage of soldiers when they get wounded on the battlefield, are we okay with that or not? So I think this is, so targeting is actually what we've been talking about, I think, for the most part today. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And I wanted to say something at the policy level. It's one thing to say, okay, as a state, I want to be limited in my applications of AI or the way I use AI because I realize that there are legal and moral limitations. But then there's the other side of the question, to me, I think is very important, is how my enemies are going to make use of AI, meaning the fact that I potentially as a state think that I can't make use of all possibilities doesn't mean that I shouldn't be doing R&D, thinking about how to counter how my future enemy, and again, you were talking, Tom, about potential other conflicts with China and others, how is that going to look like, right? What is that going to look like? So maybe it's not the same way in which I would be using AI, but I still need to think about it and try to anticipate it and counter it. So is that something that you have been thinking about in your own research about how to prepare essentially for even the things that a state wouldn't contemplate for itself? Thank you.
Maybe go to you, Joel, first, about the kind of more macro decisions around war and how they might be affected by AI, but also about defensive AI, I think, is what we are called upon to think about.
Yeah, well, I'm concerned in light of this conversation of, just another arms race. I mean, it sounds like the sort of mood of the room is that's a given. So maybe it is. And if that's a given, I think we just need to be honest about that. We're about to enter a new cycle of a race, right? So I mentioned Kissinger before. Maybe this was one of the reasons he was interested in AI. He saw the competition particularly between the United States and China, and he saw that this was going to be a really important instrument of foreign policy. So the question is, maybe we should think back to the beginning of the nuclear era. What lessons did we learn? Maybe there were some positive, maybe some negative. What were because if we're about to enter this cycle, let's think about it. The deterrence question is an interesting one. So we're sitting here, we can say that it was successful, but there's some debate about, about luck, about near misses, So I don't think we should be too sanguine about that. So I guess, I know I'm taking a super macro view, and I appreciate the points about being specific about the actual problem. But I do think, again, if we want to talk just politically, culturally, socially, where we are, I think we need to mark this moment as the beginning of a new arms race. And I haven't heard anybody in the room saying, wait a minute. That's all. That's just my only question.
Does anyone else want to maybe speak to this notion that in some states now are bound to invest in AI and war because they need to understand how the adversary is going to use it?
Excuse me, just one more point. I mean, it sounds like also there's just consensus that it's perhaps not even, I don't know if Brianna would maybe disagree, but not even worth having a conversation about whether we should try to reach some agreements, even if they're just very minimal in terms of research, development, application. I don't know. Maybe it's a waste of time. I'm not a diplomat. I've not sat in those rooms and tried to have conversations like that. But again, just looking at the big picture, it seems like we're about to just go in and nobody's asking any questions or at least having any conversations about this next cycle of research, development, deployment, implementation.
Brianna?
So I would say that the
AI arms race has already been well underway for quite some time, a decade at least, if not more. And in fact, it's important to note that Israel's actually been using AI in war since 2019. This is not the first time. It's just the first time that there's been more public awareness of it. And in fact, the technology has advanced so rapidly, even in the past year, that the impact and effects of the technology have accelerated since then. I mean, a former IDF commander said last year that in the past, in previous campaigns in Gaza, Israel would use AI to generate 50 targets a year. And then in 2023, that increased to 100 targets a day. And now this is likely thousands of targets a day. So I just want to emphasize that this is already well underway. And I do think, Joel, that it's very important that we have these conversations at the national and international levels. And we have been having those conversations. And policymakers are very aware of the need to balance safety with security, right? So they're very aware, and there's a tension in that. And everyone knows that these tools are going to be used. The problem that I think is happening is that we've been having very general, broad conversations about this issue, and we really need to get much more specific and operationalize those principles in practice and consider what the trade-offs are. So we talk a lot about risks when we talk about AI and using risk-based systems, and we're going to legislate based on risk. But I actually think that a framework that looks at ethical trade-offs is a much better way to think about that. And Carnegie has been focused on promoting that in other areas like the use of AI in diplomacy, which is another aspect of AI use. So I think we absolutely do need to be having these conversations. I just think we have to be having them in a much more granular and forensic way.
Just to build on that and also to try and take up Joel's challenge of is there an arms race and is there any point in doing about it, and perhaps introduce some challenge with 3 minutes to go or whatever.
Yes.
So I think it depends on whether there are two categories in this conversation or three, and I'm not sure where I stand on this. Let me explain. So there is definitely one category, which is this is just computers doing sums. So if you take some of the things Dr. Barak just outlined in her question, using computers to develop advanced force protection, that's going to happen. There's no plausible way of getting any form of international agreement that's going to limit that, whether it's wise or not. And on that particular example, it probably is wise. There's parts of this which is just, are we going to use technology to enhance our offensive and defensive military capabilities? Every country in the world is going to do that, and you can't. There's an element of this where there is a need for a global conversation, which is very tentatively underway. There's a question of its likelihood, but it's what the experts call the loss of control risk. In other words, where's the transition point where the computers start doing this for themselves, in which case we're in a completely different conversation, we're all stuffed. And we do need ways of limiting that. Now, is there somewhere in between which you could call an arms race? I honestly don't know. There is this thing called AI, and we're using it for advanced weaponry, and it's profoundly different. It's just not bigger, faster, better tech. I honestly don't know, and this is one of the reasons why, if there isn't a separate category, then we can't do anything. If there is, we probably should try to do things, but I don't think post-Cold War frameworks work, not just for the reasons that have been debated, but because you can be a verifiable nuclear power. There's a question. Can you detonate something using nuclear fission on an enemy territory in a targeted way? Can you use AI in war? The question doesn't translate. Yeah, of course you can. Can you use it in a sophisticated way that violates all known human norms? Well, who knows? So the question is, so that's the question. Is there this middle category? And that's what we need to keep watching.
Tom, briefly.
So I think the US and China agreed in the last few months to not use AI in either of their nuclear launch systems. And that's plainly a really valuable principle to adopt, and it could be publicly agreed to, and there's mutual benefit in that. And I think that illustrates an approach there, which is identify what the issues are and the particular use cases of AI, where there's convergent interest in coming to a treaty which says we're not going to do that, and as we'll see how far that approach can go. So that's the kind of conversation which I fully support. Yeah.
So we started out the conversation by thinking about the question whether using AI in war is just a question from an ethical and legal point of view, is how you use it, who uses it to what ends. But I think we have come to the notion that if you add pace and scale and desensitization to war, that there is, regardless of the context in which that happens, something problematic that requires our close attention and potentially requires a very concerted political effort to come up with solutions, even if it's just to very specific problems that are a small part of the overall challenge that we are facing. And I hope we can use this panel as a starting point to keep that conversation going. And we are unfortunately out of time. So I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank the Blavatnik School, the Carnegie Council, and ELAC for sponsoring this event. Particularly like to thank Brianna for organizing and convening us, and all of the panelists for sharing their insight. Thank you.